So welcome. This is styling components for React UI kits. I want to share with you in this presentation some thoughts and patterns on how can you build like really flexible components for UI kits. I mean, don't use that for your business stuff. My name is Javi Velasco. That's my Twitter handle and my beautiful dog. I work for a company called Audience. And I have this project called React Toolbox, which is an implementation of material design that at first was built using CSS modules. It turns out that this is not that a good idea at the end. I'm going to mention that later. But in the beginning, I built it as an alternative to this popular project that I'm sure almost everybody knows, which is Material UI. And suddenly, the library became very popular. So these guys are using it for internal projects in Amazon, Netflix, and Walmart. And apparently, it's working well so far for them. But I think that there are issues with the project in general, with some design flaws that are coming essentially from CSS modules. Are you familiar with CSS modules? Yeah, almost everybody. That's cool. So it's not like CSS modules is a bad idea. Just the opposite. It's a great idea. But it's probably a bad idea for React UI kits. In case you don't know about CSS modules, it's going to allow you to import CSS into an object that can be used and passed as a reference to class names that can be later locally scoped. They're going to be hashed. So you avoid collisions and you skip some issues that you usually have with regular CSS. But that gives, it turns out that there's a problem coming from that because you have to install Webpack or a module bundler or whatever to consume the library. So it is not that easy as importing the component and just use it. But you have to configure this whole thing so CSS modules can get transpiled and transformed and you change the variables and theming and everything. So that's a problem because you can't really force people to do that kind of stuff. And also there is another problem with this, which is that since class names are scoped, you can't write any selectors from outside. So if you want to modify the style of a small piece in your component. So I built this React Css Dimmer as a workaround for that exposed like an API for customization that is based in objects. So you can tell, I want to put this class name in this specific node, and React Css Dimmer is going to take care of that. But at the end, you are still using CSS. And that class name combination and applying those selectors is going to be very dependent on the priority, right? So say that I provide a component that has a very specific selector. It's very difficult to override that. So still, there are issues that got me thinking. Like, the library is working so far. People are using it. They are OK. But how can I give you a component that is completely reusable? And I mean reusable because we were told that we were never going to write another dropdown with React. You just get a dropdown and use it. But that's not true. We are usually copying code and copy and pasting because we want to change stuff that we can't really change. So have you ever built a date picker component? Anybody? That's a lot of people. Interesting. Or have you ever copied a date picker component when you build your component? Yeah, almost everybody. Because there is a lot of complex logic going on there. Another question, do you think it was really customizable, sorry? No, really, right? Because you can't change a lot of stuff, like the rendering, layout. There are difficult stuff to deal with there. So let me show you something. This is a demo of a proof of concept I made. There are two date pickers. In the left side, what you see is the Airbnb date picker, right, with those styles, this layout with two months and everything. And on the right side, what you're seeing is a React Native date picker that uses exactly the same logic. It's exactly the same logic. It's sharing everything, but it's not sharing style or anything. It's just customization and hacking a little bit, right? So usually people get like, how the fuck did you get that done? It's like impossible, no? But it is not. And I want to share with you the process that allowed me to make this thing, okay? So let's talk about the theming and customization first, because people usually mess with theming and customization. They think like it's the same thing. To me, they're quite different. So I see 3 levels in customization. First of all, you have this theming. Imagine this is a scenario where you have a bunch of components that are sharing the same primary color, for example, and you want to change that color. Usually what you do is to give some kind of variable or something, so you transpile using Sass or less or whatever, and just change the primary color. But this is possible because you can decide when you are building the components, hey, this is likely to be changed, so I'm going to extract that into a variable, so later somebody else can build a theme object and then process everything, or maybe not processing, it's not necessarily these days, but you can customize the whole thing. Right? That's theming to me. You can predict what's going to be changed, so you can define the API for that. But there is also style customization. By this, I mean like overriding styles. For example, I give you this card component in React Toolbox, and I don't think you want to change the title, maybe, because that's something that is specified in the guidelines. Right? So I can't really predict that you want to change the title, but maybe you don't care about the spec that much, and you want to change it. So I have to give you some kind of escape hatch or whatever, so you can really change that in an easy way, and not writing important at the end of a CSS selector, right? So you can't predict what's going to be changed. That's the problem. So, but still, you have to support that. And finally, there is this other customization, which is rendering customization. Nobody does this, because most of the scenarios is not like necessary, but imagine this situation where you have this date picker, the months, for the weekdays, for example, are rendered with capital letters. And you don't want that, you want the full names, for example. How can you change that? I mean, that's customization as well. Because there is something that you want to change that is given to you by default. But it's not related to styling. It's a different thing. So if you get a component that can be themed, that can be where you can easily customize the style, where you can customize rendering, you can barely change everything. You can change the whole thing if you need to, and just keep the logic. That's taking customization to the limits, and that's what I want to get done. So let's talk about how React faces styling. First of all, if not facing styling at all. So we have this common model where a component can be considered as a function of the state. You have this component, state, you generate a view, right? But everything is encapsulated into JavaScript. We are not writing with React HTML anymore. And the DOM is managed by us, for us, by React, but CSS is not taking part in this process. So they say, okay, you just define your class names and then pass class names to those components. And that's all you have to do to get something styled. So I would say that CSS or styling is not a first-class citizen in React. And that leads to problems. Like, for example, to get theming, you need building and setting up. You have, of course, in CSS, these custom properties. But custom properties are not supported by any browser. So you probably will need to use something like PostCSS or whatever to transform the whole thing. And that transformation process should happen in the final user. If I am going to give you some buttons and date pickers and stuff like that, and you want to change that color, you're going to have to process everything in the client. And again, that is forcing people to install all of these plugins or systems to transform the whole thing. That's not a good idea. But there is another issue. Like, for example, you want to use the component, but the CSS is not there because it's not a first-class citizen in React. So you have to import in some way in the document the CSS. Of course, you can ship the component with CSS loader, but again, you can't do that because you need to process that in real time or at bundling time, at build time, sorry. So we are happy with React, and we are happy with React handling it on for us. So I may ask, what if we take style as a function of a state too? Because it is, actually. What we do is to create like a combination of class names. So we decide what class name is a modifier depending on the state. And all of that logic is happening in the component itself. But it is then a function of the state too. So can we handle CSS as React does with HTML? Yes, we do, with CSS in JS. The implementation of the JavaScript fatigue with these 60 different libraries out there, right? But particularly, I'm going to use for the examples style components, just because I like the API. There are great libraries out there. We have some authors here that are very smart. And you can use whatever you want, actually, but I'm going to use that as an example. So it is described, style components, as primitives for the component era. And you build your components, final components, based on those primitives. So let me show you an example first. This is how we can build for a button, right? We have this button. It is receiving a primary property, and we are deciding which class name is going to be included depending on the property. And what we are rendering is a button component. It's a button element, right? That renders directly to the DOM. So the problem with this is that you are encapsulating this logic to decide how the component is going to look like in the component itself and not in the node that is going to be rendered, because eventually when you write CSS, you want to target on a specific element. So it makes sense to write those styles directly into the component, into the node that is going to get rendered. Just think about the abstraction. That's what's interesting. In style components, though, you can create a button like this. Are you familiar with style components, by the way? And I didn't ask, yeah, right? Almost everybody? OK. So style components is going to allow you to create a component, just calling a method like this. And you can, this is going to produce a component that gets rendered with one element, which is going to be a link, obviously. So you just call that function and pass the styles that this element is going to have eventually. But what is more interesting is that you can interpolate at the end a function. And that function is going to be called with the props of the button component. So you can use properties of this component to decide what's going to be the style. So in this case, what we're seeing is these props, if I'm including the primary prop, if it's evaluated to truthy, I'm going to add a white background and this color. We change the abstraction. We are not telling if this property primary exists, I'm going to add this class name that I don't know what are the styles for that class name. But what we are telling is add these styles when it gets this property. And that's interesting because you use the component like that at the end, just button primary. But primary is the modifier, but not a class name, but a property. That's cool, right? So when you compose your components, you can, with something like style components, not style components necessarily, you focus on building your components, rendering two components instead of rendering two elements. So I have this here. Maybe designers would be happy with the right side, but we developers are more happy with the right side, right? So if you render two elements, the problem is that you have to link class name, combine those class name and everything, and you are mapping to this combination. You have no built-in strategy for daeming, and also the overriding style is going to rely on the selector priority. But using just components is a much more powerful abstraction, and it's going to give you theming for free because probably the library that you use to produce those components already supports a way to get theming done. And also the customization can rely on the library itself instead of in the browser. So let's try to embrace this approach and see how can you really solve this theming and style customization using style components in this case, okay? Using those primitives. So theming is very, very easy. It's just like this. You create your component, interpolate this function at the end, and you grab the color or whatever value you want to interpolate from the theme object that is going to be passed in the properties. But how can you get that? Easy. Just use this provider pattern that is very common in React. I'm sure everybody used Redux at least once and watched that provider, right? So you just create your theme and use it for the theme provider. So every component that is inside there is going to know how to grab that theme object. So you can theme easily with style components. That's cool. But what if I want to override style? I mean, style customization. That's customization. That's the problem. How can we get that done? Style component is giving you a way to customize components, but not elements, by passing a class name down. But I like this approach too, where you just interpolate at the end of the CSS a function that returns a property, which is style. You might wonder, what is that style? It could be a representation of a piece of CSS just like this, okay? And what is really, really cool about this is that you can still interpolate a function in that piece of CSS. I mean, this is not directly related to the component. It is alone. It can be used in any component as long as it gets a primary property. So this is very nice because you can customize stuff not only based on properties that are defined for the component, but with additional properties that you can pass to that component. And this is how you use it. You just use this button and pass the styles object like that. And you get a customized button that you can be sure that it's going to get those styles applied because you are interpolating at the end. There is a warning with this, in style components in particular, which is that the more you interpolate, the bigger is the CSS, the harder it is to parse the whole thing. So if you're doing a lot of rendering, like for very heavy animations and stuff like that, it might not be that good idea. But again, you can use something else, and if it's based, for example, on objects, you can just merge two objects. But this is fine because it's rendering to one single node. What happens if it is a more complex component? How can we deal with that? You have to design some kind of API for that. So picture this. You have this counter component that is composed by two different nodes. These primitives are wrapper and count. So what you do is to turn this style property into an object. And the properties for these objects can be the same as the name you use for the node. So you are designing here like a contract where you are saying, my counter component is composed by wrapper and count. So you give me a styles object that use these wrapper and count properties so I can know what are the styles override that you want to pass to these primitives, okay? But you can use it like this, by the way. You just create your counter, pass that pieces of CSS. In the case for all the library, it could be an object with the properties, and you render like that. Just render your counter, pass the styles, boom, done. But with this approach, how can you solve render customization? And this is what is really interesting. It's the most difficult part, probably, in this talk. Again, back to this counter component. In this counter component, we are importing from somewhere these wrapper and count elements. Components. And we are just using them like that. But rendering customization, what if I want the wrapper to render something else and not just the children? What if I have this counter, that is a wrapper and a counter inside, and I want to put some kind of phrase or whatever inside the wrapper? How can I do that? Well, what you can do is to expose a function that receives those two components instead of just importing them. This is dependency injection. This is a classic concept, right? So you get those wrapper and count components and return the counter component. This is just like a factory. And then, how can you use this? How can you use this function? It's as simple as this. This is very declarative, right? It's like, build a counter where the wrapper is going to look like this, and the count is going to look like this. And it's very declarative, it's very clear. It's nice, right? But the cool thing, and what I like about style components, is, again, this abstraction. Because after style components, there are adapters for React Fila, for JSS, that allows you to use the same API. Like you call this function and return a component that bundles the styles. So you can use something else. You can use Fila, for example, to get, and look at this. They look almost the same, right? But they are different styling libraries. But you know what is cooler? That you can use React Native too. Because that abstraction, that component node abstraction, it doesn't matter if it's a div or a span or a view or a text. It's just a contract that you define for the component, right? But there is a problem with that. The contract is implicit. It is there, and apparently it can't be modified. So let's get evil, and let me put it this way. Like, what if I want to have a red background where the counter value is higher than 10? For example, is that even possible? And this is my approach for that. You pass an additional property to this function, which is the pass-through function. This pass-through function has this contract, like it has to return an object, and this object can be spread in each node. So this function can be used to decide what properties are going to be passed down to every single element inside of this component. And the arguments for this function are going to be the name of the component node that it's being called and the props of the component itself. So an implementation that allows me to solve that problem, turning the background red, the wrapper background, when the counter is higher than 10, could be something like this. I just say, if this function is being called with the wrapper component, for the wrapper, I'm going to return this object that includes count, where count is the children of my counter element, right? And with that, I can know that wrapper is going to receive this counter property. So later, I can just use it like that. I can use this interpolation, and I know that props are going to include count. So I can say, if it's higher than 10, turn the background red. And this can be done with any other property with internal handlers and everything. But of course, there are problems. Like the API can become very, very complex. And the documentation, believe me, could be huge, especially for components that are very complex. And also, you don't know exactly what properties are going to receive each node because the contract is inside of the component. That can be solved using static typing, for example. You know what properties should the component accept. So as you write this component, you can get insight on what are the allowed properties. And also, if you use a property that is not going to be passed, it's going to complain, like using TypeScript or Flow, something like that. And of course, the last problem is that you have to reveal the internals. But you know what? It's cool. This is very, very cool. We get done with this approach the 3 different layers that I mentioned before. You get theming, you get overrides, and you get render customization. So back to React Toolbox. This means, sort of, the final version of React Toolbox, which is going to be using style components. But the cool part is that we are going to use internally this abstraction. So all components in React Toolbox are going to be, not all, but the most complex ones, are going to be built using these factory functions. And all of these utilities, higher order components, factory functions and stuff, they are going to be extracted into an external library, which is React Toolbox Core. And this is going to be a set of agnostic component factories, higher order components, and utilities that are going to allow you that to, instead of using a dropdown and change that dropdown entirely, you import this factory function for a dropdown and then decide how each node is going to look like. So thanks for listening. That's all I got. Thank you. Okay, questions? Have you seen the render props pattern? Do you think that's a cool way of applying full customization? Actually, everybody went crazy with this render props pattern. I tried it out, and like everything else, it cannot be applied to every single use case. I mean, it is cool because it allows you to be very explicit on the properties that are going to be passed by this, what can be a higher order component. But I have some use case where it is not possible to apply this pattern. But I think that when it's possible, you should definitely use it, because it's way more explicit, and I like it. And some components in the React Toolbox core are going to include this, this pattern. But for example, I have this one where you get you have a list, like a numbered list and list items, and you want to make that list navigable. So you can use the arrows in your keyboard, navigate, and it's going to handle the scroll and everything. This has nothing to do with styles. But the problem is that I need to know what's going to be the list element, which is the one that is going to be decorated, and also I need to know what are going to be the children and pass some properties to the children. So I have to decorate a not one single component, but a structure. And in that case, I'm afraid it is not possible to use it. But if you think that the render props pattern is applicable, you should definitely go for that, because it's way more explicit, that composition, using higher order components. So this one, so downshift by PayPal. That's the thing. I didn't heard before the conference about downshift, and it was mentioned to me during these last 2 days, and I think it's going to be very interesting, but I couldn't check it out yet. But I'm gonna definitely take a look into that, because if it's pretty similar, I think that I can get something from there valuable, definitely. So, but sorry, I have no opinion, because I have to check it out like deeper. Yeah. How this approach well, if you depend on Twitter Bootstrap? Whoa. Does anybody depend on Twitter Bootstrap anymore? Cool. No, I don't know. I think that this has nothing to do. I mean, you can use this when you want to ship a component that has to be very, very customizable, but it doesn't mean that you have to use it for your internal components. For example, I was mentioning before that CSS modules is a very, very, very nice approach when it comes to styling, but it is okay if you have control of an environment. I have some projects where I am using CSS modules, and I'm very happy with that. But this is because I don't have to expose those components to be customized later. So yeah, I think that that would work preferably, because you are still using class names regarding that Bootstrap question. So that's all. Thank you.